So are you saying, Sean, that just as we put an emphasis on our relationships with Israel, we should also be putting an emphasis on our relationships with Saudi? Like, do you see these governments as no different in their legitimacy?
Just for example, in the sense that I think Iran and Saudi both are a massive source of, I mean, if I was to be quite general, I mean, Israel, Saudi, and Iran are kind of these three axes here, and that one promotes a kind of form of Jewish nationalism, one a kind of Shia nationalism, and one a kind of Sunni, extreme Sunni nationalism, right? Like they are, the kind of geopolitical games that these countries play are not good for anyone. Like they bring so much instability to the region, and they're so self-serving and transparent, and it's despicable, isn't it? Like, and the relationship the Saudis
garbage, Sean. The only state that has an exclusive citizenship policy is Israel. Iran doesn't have an exclusive citizenship policy, nor does Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia famously in the 80s, before this war with Yemen, had offered and had given the hundreds of thousands of Yemeni workers citizenship. King Fahd, I believe, gave them citizenship. So citizenship in Saudi Arabia was not based upon ethnic lines, nor is it
not about
citizenship. So there are
also Arabs in Israel that have Israeli citizenship. Doesn't mean it doesn't have Jewish nationalism. I'm saying that in terms of its foreign policy and its geopolitical maneuvering, I would say
the setup of the state. We're talking about the setup of the state. The setup of Israel was.
But I don't restrict myself to.
It's set up as an ethnic state.
Perhaps, okay, you could argue that, but I don't restrict myself to.
Iran wasn't set up like that. Saudi Arabia wasn't set up.
No, but I wasn't. What I was saying is you could argue about that. Isn't the point I was restricting myself to. I was saying that in terms of its foreign policy maneuvers and what it does abroad and the harm it does, I think Saudi does pursue a kind of an anti-Iranian, has a kind of anti-Iranian axis. You can argue with that if you like, but
I'm not. That's the point. You're making your point. I'm making my point. The state of Israel was set up as an ethnic state. It was an ethno-state. The state of Iran was not set up as an ethno-state. The state of Saudi Arabia was not set up as an ethno-state. So they're different insofar as that goes.
But are you saying being set up as an ethno-state is the only thing that could kind of preclude?
That's the point I'm making, Sean. That's just.
Yeah, I know. Okay, yeah, I hear what you're saying.
And separating all three of them.
I could say that'd be one of the things that leads to a country being very unjust. Like if a country is set up in a certain way that it's very exclusive, that could be one of the things that allows you to paint it as not very democratic and not worth negotiating with. But I would say there are other things in my mind that would put a country under that kind of category that you shouldn't really have any truck with them. I think what Saudi has done against Yemen is a classic example. Like, it's despicable, and that's what I'm saying. It's another example. And
these are just these are talking points, and I'm just bringing my talking point, which is that Israel was set up as an ethno-state. Iran was not set up as an ethno-state. Saudi Arabia was not set up as an ethno-state. That's the simple point I'm making. And I do want to make other points, so I appreciate if I can. With regards to the question I want to wrestle with or kind of put out there is, at what point does political violence delegitimize a government? Because when we were discussing Libya, there were many anecdotes about political repression and political violence that had occurred, and that was used as a reason for delegitimizing the Gaddafi era. So, in the spirit of consistency, the question becomes: is the state of Israel delegitimized from its inception, given that the Irgun were going around bombing the British presence, as well as the Arabs in the region, and attacking Arabs in the region, and the Nakba and all of that? We're not even needing to go into the inception of Israel. We're talking about even pre quote unquote establishment. That's the question. So if it does, at what point does political violence delegitimize a government? Because obviously the topic today was, before it was changed, of course, was Syria. And I was...
yeah, okay, but Oz, can I answer that point?
Yeah, can I answer that point? Just finish the point. One second. And with the topic of Syria, or the conversation around Syria, the conversation I would assume, go around the delegitimization of the Assad regime, right? And how he's such a bad guy for what has happened in Syria and whatnot. So yeah. I think you should definitely schedule in that show, because it will be an interesting show about Syria. But the question is, at what point does political violence delegitimize a government?
That's a fair question, but I think it's it's a bit of a red herring in the sense that in the real world, in terms of we're anti-national. I mean, I think Oz agrees with me on this one. I'm fundamentally anti-nationalist, and I think nation states of themselves, like race, as we were talking about before, is a construct, and it's the centralized government or centralized state is inherent to that is all sorts of injustices. And but that more general point aside, when you have countries that are in existence that have a body of unjust laws and have been indeed unjust from their inception. You could look at the countries like the US, or indeed most colonial states in the Americas were built on the extermination of the indigenous people. There are so many countries that were born through war, through autocracy, or through the extermination of certain indigenous people.
So it's whataboutism.
Or displacement of indigenous people. What I'm saying is you have to, in the real world, have to often kind of grapple with those countries, decide how you're going to I don't know, interact with them.
Basically,
I'm trying to say you have to decide how you interact with them, but at the same time, how you're going to put pressure on that country to change, both from an external point of view, and it's not whataboutism at all. What I'm trying to say is how you have to get to the practical point of what is the best way to try and get Israel to change in terms of
this is what I'm saying. It's all, when it's about Israel, it's okay, what is the best way to do it? How can we use the mechanisms of cooperation and so on and so forth in order to move it forward, and all of this long-winded nonsense. But when it comes to
BDS, how is BDS cooperation?
When it comes to Syria, which no, Assad has got to go. When it comes to Libya, Gaddafi has got to go. When it comes to Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, he's got to go. Mansour al-Hadi, he can come to Saudi Arabia. We're going to put him back. Yankovic in Ukraine, he's delegitimate because he left the country. Even though al-Mansour al-Hadi in Yemen left the country, he's not delegitimate. He's going to be. So the point is here, without getting into all of these details, is that the selective use of human rights, or the selective use of human rights abuses, the selective use of this delegitimizing framework when it comes to the application to political violence, when it comes to any particular state, is very selective. And the question is always going to be cui bono, in whose interest is it? So when it comes to the destabilizing, or whether it's soft coup attempts or hard coup attempts in any country, in any particular country, the point is whose interests does it serve? And it's very seldom the interests of the people that are concerned. However, it's always sold to the people that are concerned in romantic, flowery language, just like, even the Tunisian thing was called the Jasmine Revolution, or whether it's the Libyan Revolution, or whatever, the whole Arab Spring, which is ironically modeled on which is really the NATO Spring Clean. But that's another topic.
So can I just say, I agree. Look, I don't disagree with you, man. I'm just saying that, are you saying that, I mean, I don't think I've applied that inconsistently, but if you're saying other people or certain governments have an inconsistent approach here, and that they're willing to work democratically with certain states, for example, with Israel or with Saudi, I would say, like the British have had a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia and have never tried to undermine the legitimacy of their rulers, as far as I'm aware. But on the other hand, they'll go and say that. So, but in terms of, if you're asking my view on that, I would say, I think that it's just as I think you have to ask yourself how you can engage with a country in a way that you can encourage it to change for the better. I would say I would have that approach. I never encouraged intervention in Libya. I never encouraged intervention in Syria. But I think what you have to ask yourself, just as I was encouraging those other practical questions, once there is a revolution, once there is a civil war, what way can you have a peace process that is most likely to bring about that democratic change afterwards, which I think can be a different question when that country isn't going through a civil war. I mean, if there was a massive uprising in Israel, let's say, or another intifada, as I've supported BDS for a long time, I supported the last uprising series of that thing that was looking like it might turn into intifada. Do you remember? I was kind of a few years back. Like, I was supporting that, and these movements. And I've also discussed with Oz in a Facebook chat room recently that we invited these other guys to, that who you have to ask yourself, do you support mass movement? What do you think is more effective, and what do you support more on moral grounds, like mass movements that are generally non-violent or kind of violent uprisings? I think that's another very interesting question. And there was a really interesting study that I linked them to, which they really didn't like, because these people that you were friends with was a kind of hardcore Marxist by the look of it. And Zoe, you would probably class them as kind of the extremists, these class extremists you were trying to catch me with earlier. In that they thought like non-violent revolution was a joke and non-violent movements couldn't achieve anything. Or I don't know what their point was, to be honest. But I linked them to this article that said that actually evidence suggests that massive movement, non-violent movements, generally non-violent movements, according to this huge study with a massive data set, that suggested that they had more chance of long-term success, of creating long-term successful change in the country that they're. Do you see what I'm trying to say, Zoe?
I understand. I understand what you're saying. I've got two views on this. The first is, okay, even though I disagree, and I do think that Israel is a special case, and I'll explain why in a second. Yeah. The first point is that you're actually quite consistent, because you believe race is a construct, and at the same time you're reluctant to say that Israel is an ethnic state, which is a consistent position. If the reason that you're reluctant to say that is because you're not sure what they mean by saying it's a Jewish state. Is it ideologically Jewish? Is it ethnically Jewish? Is it religiously Jewish? Yeah. So I believe you have a consistent.
I think you'd agree it's a tribal state then.
I think that they had, that they were trying to model themselves after various kind of colonial states of the previous centuries, as a response to what they saw as the kind of European racism of the 20th, 19th, and 18th centuries, and so on and so forth. But it's fundamentally misguided. Yeah, it's fundamentally misguided.
Okay, fine. Okay, but I believe it is a special case, because it's the only current example of extreme modern day colonialism that is still, to an extent, legitimized in some international institutions.
What do you base that on? I mean, I would argue China China's a much bigger country, but if you look at way it practices, I mean, I know someone who, a good friend of mine, her name is Rosie, actually. I think I told you about it once.
Are you talking about China's presence in Hong Kong?
Yeah, she spent, no, not talking about Hong Kong, or not just Hong Kong. She was kind of a Christian missionary, but not a missionary. She went there to do kind of engagement with the Christian community, who we know is under a lot of repression in certain parts of China. And she said one of the things that you have to remember most about China is that because it's such a massive country, and they kind of, to an extent, molded themselves after the socialist idea of communes and a certain degree of local government and so on, that each of the provinces of China, or regions of China, have quite a lot of self-government. There can be some variation there. But so just with that caveat, you look at places like Xinjiang, Tibet, like you could say hold on, let me just finish the point. What China is doing in places like Xinjiang in Tibet is a clear example of ethnic colonialism. And if you look at Tibet, they estimate they've killed 1 million Tibetans since 1950, that they have various laws in place which allow the movement of Chinese Han national, ethnic Han Chinese to there. And if you look at the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and if you look at India as well, in terms of what they've just recently started doing in Kashmir, that's colonialism.
Wait, hang on. You're missing two bits that I said. I didn't say it's the only example of colonialism. What I said is it's the only example of extreme modern day colonialism that is largely legitimized by major international institutions. That's what I said.
No, I disagree. I think people look at what's happening in the UK right now with the Labour Party. I mean, obviously the Conservatives lost cause. The Labour Party is legitimizing Kashmiri colonialism.
That is the difference. That is the operative difference. That China and India are both internationally condemned to some extent, at least some international players.
America condemns Tibet. America condemns.
Yeah, exactly. Nah. I don't buy that for a second.
Even with Taiwan. Sean, you can't try it, man. Come on.
No, man, I think that's rhetoric, man. If you look at India and China, the way that they are part of the international community and they're welcomed in terms of trade and international prestige, I don't think really, like, look at the Labour Party.
China and India are both widely condemned for what happened in Tibet and what's happening in Xinjiang, and India is widely condemned for its actions in Kashmir. There is not a single. Anyway, I'm not even going to get bogged down on this. It's futile. It's futile. The reality is that Israel is an ethno state. It set itself up as an ethno state, despite what your ideas are on ethnicity or race or, you know, being constructs and all of that. The fact remains that it's not a colonial state, it's an ethno state, and it's set up as an ethno state, which contrasts it with all of those countries that you mentioned. The fact is that the US of A is not an ethno state yet. The UK is not an ethno state. There is not an equivalent ethno state in this world. And the irony is, of course, and I think a lot of people are clocking onto this, is of course that whilst Israel lives in an ethno state for the most part, right, and is very, very much protective over its ethno state and very much protective over the demographics, just see the fact that there is no widespread acceptance of the law of return for the Palestinians who have been expelled because of the demographic shift that would cause. So Israel is an ethno state, but then ethno states are derided across the world, and they're made out to be some virulent type of virus. So what people are recognizing is, hold on a sec, why isn't what's good for the goose good for the gander?
Yeah, but can I answer your point, Zoe? Because look, I don't think you guys actually did dispute my point. I think you're saying that there is a kind of quantitative difference. You could argue that you could argue that there is a quantitative difference in terms of the amount of people that condemn what's happening in Kashmir
or
Tibet or in Xinjiang, but that is qualitative. That there's something different about it. I don't agree at all.
The quantitative.
I think there's no qualitative difference, and I don't see any real action on the part of the international.
Wait, there is a qualitative difference.
No, hold on, let me just answer this point. I don't believe. I mean, I'm open to having my mind changed on this, but I don't believe that there is a real difference on a qualitative level in terms of how much the international community really challenges what's happening colonially in terms of places like these other places that I've named. And if you look at Israel, there is some action. So you could say, I do think it's an ethnic state, and I think actually you're wrong. You're asked to say that my attempt to inject some nuance here as a result of my kind of issues with race as a construct. I think it's two different things, and Zoeb is right, and you're right to say that's not relevant. It's not relevant.
No, I think
Israel. I think Israel is as expands, and as you often see with these states, right? The ethno-colonial aspect comes in on the peripheries of these states as they expand, right? And with Israel in the 1948 to 67, because that was within Israel, what we call Israel proper. Now, most people would say that within Israel, within the kind of 67 borders, there are laws that discriminate against Arabs, but I don't think any reasonable person would say that they even remotely compare to the kind of the level of apartheid that we have in the kind of West Bank area. And at least though, with the West Bank settlements, you see some people like in the European Union and elsewhere who say that we need to boycott the West Bank settlements. We need to boycott the goods that come out of these places. I would love for you guys to tell me where there's anywhere else where they say there's a massive movement.
Right.
There was stirrings of this in the US Senate and Congress where they said
to let me respond.
Tried to bring up a bill. They tried to bring up a bill where they said that we should start to boycott or challenge the Chinese policies in Xinjiang, where they might have imprisoned up to 3 million, is the higher estimate. 3 million Uyghurs could have gone through the security apparatus, the colonial security apparatus in that state. That movement was crushed. Where is there a country in the world that is actually saying we should boycott goods or something from these areas?
Hang on. All right. Look, let me be really clear about what my opinion is, because I haven't developed it. My view is this: with Israel, there is a qualitative and quantitative difference. And let me explain why. The world superpower right now, despite what people think about China balancing US, whatever, it's America. That is the case right now. We all drink Coca-Cola, we all wear jeans, we all listen to, like, we are influenced by Pax Americana. That's like the new Roman Empire.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Now, we have a situation where that superpower literally is completely complicit. I would argue is active. If you look at AIPAC and the way that they finance and lobby for Israel, is active in preserving the colonialism and division in Israel right now, right? And why is the qualitative connected to the quantitative? Because America as a superpower qualitatively can consolidate other people to agree with its opinion. So this distinction between the qualitative and the quantitative is not valid.
You're saying by the sheer power, the sheer extent of US power, that quantitative difference becomes a qualitative one. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, look, I get what you're saying.
And emphasizing the Israel lobby, because that's the other thing. You mentioned anti-Semitism in Labour earlier, so I think it's only fair that you mention the recent report, the leaks that have come out, which has illustrated that a small cabal or a small group within the Labour Party HQ.
No, I wasn't mentioning. I wasn't talking about.
Not you. I was mentioning earlier.
Oh, sorry. I was talking about.
I was mentioning about anti-Semitism in Labour. and the fact. What I'm saying is when he just raised it up as a point, but he didn't mention the fact that revelations have come out now that it was a concerted effort to smear Jeremy Corbyn essentially, and the person who was dealing with the complaints kept trying to draw Jeremy Corbyn and like the top brass of Labour into the kind of complaints procedures, but to what end? To the smear campaign. As I say, it's all come out now, isn't it?
So did you see that? I'm assuming then you're referring to the recent report, yeah? The one that came out.
Yeah, of course. The whole anti-Semitism thing when it comes to Labour. But the point is, why did this again? Let's not decontextualize. No, wait. Let's not decontextualize it, because we'll get caught up on the details and we'll forget what the point is. So let me make my point. The point of me raising this is that when you've got a political personality like Jeremy Corbyn, who is balanced, he's not extreme in the slightest when it comes to the issue of Palestine. Yeah, he was able, and the point is, the media was mobilized, and Jeremy Corbyn was through that media smeared, and delegitimized, and obviously you have to link this now to the documentary that was made by Al Jazeera, The Lobby, which famously showed the infiltration of that Yavi guy, the guy who was basically attached to the Israeli embassy. The point is the insidious influence that a foreign nation has on domestic politics, whether it's the UK, we can talk about the UK, we don't need to get into the US, but in the UK, would not be tolerated for any other nation, whether that's China, Iran, or any of the other usual suspect enemies. So that's the interesting point.
I think I wouldn't dispute that. The recent report was quite shocking, and that said that there were people within the Labour Party who were willing to sabotage the party's their own party's electoral success over their disagreement with Corbyn. And one of the major areas that they disagreed with him on, because of the kind of influence of the Israeli Foreign Office, if you like, was on the issue of Israel, and that people thought that he was too radical, which of course I agree with you all on, and that he wasn't at all. Yeah, he wanted a peaceful.
But Sean, do you agree that Israel is a special case? Because
I agree that they are. Obviously, any person with eyes can see that. That they, like any country, try to exert themselves abroad, but to the extent to which they exert themselves abroad is tolerated massively by the US, by the UK, and these other countries that are their nominal allies. I mean, obviously, I'd question to what extent they were really their allies, to the extent that if you were really Israel's friend, you wouldn't want it to be taking itself down this path, right? Like, they do it for, I think the US and the UK sometimes do it that in terms of their own self-interest too. I think the US wanted a kind of colonial outpost in the region for its own kind of military and geopolitical interest. Right?
Again, let's be real. Like this takes away from the agency of Israel. The fact is, like you said, most countries will try and exert themselves abroad, granted, but Israel somehow is managing to overexert itself abroad. Now, the idea that this is somehow negative, as in, the allies who are allowing it, the UK, the US, who allows them to do this, is somehow working against the interests of Israel, is nonsense. Because the fact is that Israel it's a question of whether the dog is wagging the tail or the tail is wagging the dog. It depends upon how you see it. However which way you see it, it doesn't really matter, because the end point is that the kind of the victim narrative. Let me break it down. Why there would be no change in Israel? When you've got a narrative of victimhood, as Israel has constructed and has made it a part of their national mythology, and they have the romantic ideals and the kind of the almost schizophrenic relationship between religion and ethnicity that they have. So these two issues, which basically means that any real type of reform or any type of real, like for example, the issue of the right of return for Palestinians, like we just say that, but we know in reality that it's a political non-starter within Israel. It doesn't matter if you're the leftist leaning party in Israel, you're not going to get into power by calling upon the right of this right of return for the Palestinians who have been expelled and are in Syria or Lebanon or wherever. Because the fact is that would change the demographics on the ground to an extent where the Israelis, quote unquote, would be outnumbered. So, as I say, I think in terms of self-preservation, the self-preservation of Israel is inextricably linked to the nation, to the ethno-state status of the country.
Yeah, can I respond to that? So, just to get back to your quickly address your tail wagging the dog point, I was saying it's both, in that sometimes forces or individuals within the US or UK or other Israeli allies support Israel out of a genuine, I don't know, support for certain Israeli objectives or whatever, or support for Israel, or they sometimes do it out of their own self-interest or for the interest of their own country. I think the US, it's in the US's own foreign policy interest to sometimes support Israel. That's all I was trying to say. But the other point about what you're saying in terms of pressuring is, of course, the nationalists, the Jewish nationalists within Israel, it's not in their interest to allow kind of a significant demographic shift. It's obviously not, it's not in their interest, but it was the same calculus that people in South Africa made for so long, right? Like they knew if they gave the ANC power that it would be, it changed through international pressure and boycott efforts and so on and so on, which is why I support BDS.
And a violent struggle that was supported by Gaddafi.
Yeah, well,
Sean, the thing is, yeah, like the problem that we have right now is when you say it's a special case, people say you're anti-Semitic because you're isolating and exceptionalizing a Jewish state. But the thing is, why is Israel branding itself as an ethno state? And a lot of these developments are recent. When it knows it's subject to criticism, it's almost like it's putting itself in the firing line so that when we do exceptionalize it, then they can retrospectively rationalize it.
I think it depends on how. It depends on how you.
Hang on. I think that they're linking between the Israeli political projects, the political Zionist projects, and their ethnocentric ideology, I think is completely intentional because it deliberately conflates our political contentions and our human rights and legal contentions with their behavior with a criticism of Jewish people. And
well, look, the Zionists were very clever. I mean, in the end, they have to give them credit in the sense that, you know, they were able to exploit the European countries. They were able to use the righteous guilt of the, they were able to use the guilt of the Europeans in terms of over the Holocaust to play into their national mythology, as they're referred to, and building that justification for their state, right? They played on their guilt, the massive guilt of the European states, which happened to be and are still are, you know, the Western powers are the dominant force on earth, right? And they kind of use the carrot and stick approach. Like they use this carrot approach of, you know, we'll be your ally in the region, we'll trade with you, we'll be your buddy. And then the stick approach was, but if you don't help us, you know, you aren't atoning sufficiently for the crimes of the Nazis, right? It's a very clever approach in terms of constructing a national mythology and justifying their crimes and so on and so on. But to answer your other question about when it's anti-Semitic, I don't think, at least I hope anyway, intelligent people wouldn't say that it was inherently anti-Semitic to exceptionalize or to claim that Israel was acting as some kind of exceptional. The way things are played out is almost some kind of exception. That it's acting in a way that other countries, if they acted the same way, would be condemned. When you say that it's how you say they're an exception. If people claim it's because of the Jews or the Zionists have some special power or they have some kind of cunning that other people just inherently don't have, or what, then when people kind of get into that territory, then it's kind of seen as anti-Semitic. If you can identify quite rationally the historical circumstances that led us to this point, then it's not anti-Semitic, right? Like it's just when you get into the conspiracies about the Rothschilds control everything.
Yeah, then I agree. Fine,
that's
I agree.
BS, man. Like, but when you talk about the historical circumstances and stuff, then it's all perfectly rational. You can just like connecting the breadcrumbs in it. Like,
I agree, right? But the thing is, what I don't understand is that when apartheid was happening in South Africa, when human rights abuses were happening in Bosnia, in Iraq or whatever, there was no debate. There was no discussion. Yeah, there were the odd people like the white South African nationalist movement that were trying to explain it in their own way. But generally speaking, there was no discussion. Why is this even debatable? I don't understand why subjugating a child or a pregnant mother to a military checkpoint on the way to a hospital in a country where she's born, she's literally born in that land. Why is that even? Why are we having a discussion about it?
Israel is one of the biggest clients of the like the UK. I believe that we export a massive amount of arms to them. The US does. I mean, per capita. I mean, you've probably seen the statistics, right? About if you look at Israel per capita, like in terms of the amount of people in the country. Not like because if you include places like Pakistan, but you don't account for that in terms of the size of the country. Then, but if you look at as in the amount of people in Israel, it's because it's quite a small country, right? They've received by far the amount proportionally of kind of foreign aid
Exactly.
of the US, of
Israel
any other.
they're not beggars. They're not people who have their hands out. Let's be real. Again, Israel was critical to South Africa's nuclear fucking program. I'm sorry to swear, but it really gals me when people make out as though Israel is just on a receiving end, as though they haven't been on the front foot of arms trafficking.
No, that's not what I was going to say.
One second. No. I'm going to make the point. So Israel has been on the front foot when it comes to arms trading to the most heinous governments across the Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Let's be real here. Israel was critical in supporting right-wing fascist governments in Central and South America.
Yeah.
Guatemala,
I agree. No,
for example,
I agree, no.
supporting death. No, wait. No, supporting death squads, literally.
Yeah.
I know.
So
hold up. So not only is Israel implicated in facilitating the nuclear program for the only other apartheid state in the world, South Africa, it is also implicated in arms trafficking, the same crime that you was talking about UK and arming Saudi Arabia, which I agree with. The same crime, exact same crime Israel is guilty of when it comes to its arms. It was for a country, when you look at the country and how small it is and the actual kind of impact it has on the international arms trade, it's second to none. Israel is top 10 every year without fail. So what I'm saying is that with that facilitation for despotic governments, the question comes up again: at what point does political violence delegitimize a government? Because what I'm saying is, in those three crimes that I've highlighted now, for me, it's an open and shut case. It goes back to what Uz was saying, like how is there even a debate? And the reason why there's a debate is because Israel is the exceptional state. The other factor that hasn't been mentioned is, of course, the religious manipulation. The fact that Christian Zionists in America believe that their savior is going to be in Israel, and all of that mythology around that topic. So the book by Mearsheimer, Israel was
Mearsheimer's sick, man.
Yeah, what's that book? What's the book by Professor Mearsheimer called?
The Israel Lobby, I think.
It is the Israel Lobby, right? Okay, so in it, he kind of explores how it is that Israel has this exceptional state and why it is that it has this inordinate influence on U.S. foreign policy. And the point is that there is no comparison with any other state.
Yeah, no, look, I'm not disagreeing. You're again trying to paint maybe a false dichotomy here. And that I was saying that they have a mutually beneficial relationship. I was saying that they sell weapons. I was saying that the UK and other people sell weapons to Israel, which then Israel then also sells to other people, and they have this very close relationship. They benefit from each other, and the UK and the US know that. And the US, of course, also supported death squads. Has also supported extremely terrible regimes around the world, right? Like in South America, Central America. I'm saying that they see Israel as being a huge client in the region that pursues their interests, and Israel knows how much it relies on the US support or US justification. Like the US justifies Israel in terms of that raw economic manner, in terms of supplying them economically, but also provides them that kind of ideological justification. And it is logical for the Israelis to realize that close relationship that they have with the US, to play on it and to maintain it at all costs. Like you would nurture the hell out of that relationship, wouldn't you, if you were saying?
But do you not see, like, Sean, the thing is, you know, when we learn about the slave trade and Black history or whatever at school, and then we learn about the people that were trying to justify it when it was taken to court in Britain and whatever, and we look at them in hindsight and we think, how can you do that? Yeah. History is going to judge us exactly the same way. Anyone that is trying to split hairs over this, like, it might make a nice airtime, like when Katie Hopkins or Milo, whatever, comes out and says, oh, this and that. It might make a nice airtime. It might make their Twitter following all nice, right?
Yeah.
In 100 years' time, they're going to be on the wrong side of history, and their grandchildren are going to look at them like they were extremely morally questionable people. It's not worth like developing. I don't understand these people that try to create this niche for themselves by being sympathetic towards Israel and therefore propelling into like on Breitbart or whatever. It's really not worth it. It's not worth the judgment of history, and it's not worth the judgment of your own actions. I don't get it.
Bro, I don't get it either, man. No, who does? Who has a sense of has a single bone in their body where they love justice, where they love truth, I mean, there are so many things evil things that are justified in the name of economic profitability or whatever, or in the name of a messianic ideology, as these kind of Christian Zionists have that Zoe alludes to. I mean, it's not just Israel that is justified through these kind of economic and ideological things. So many world historical crimes. I mean, I could point to at least like a dozen. I don't know if you give me the time, but like climate change, like climate change, man. Like, how are people going to look back at us and think like, how much did they go through to justify what we're doing to the environment and how we're literally destroying the planet, man? How can people justify that to themselves? How can they justify any of these things to themselves? How they can sleep at night is beyond me, man. Like the Quran talks about how the most of the shayateen are actually in human form, right? They're among us. These psychopaths or these people that are so blinded by greed. They don't give a shit, man. Pick a cause. There are people, greedy people, who pursue it, like an unjust cause. Like,
I think Amal wanted to come in, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, sorry, Amal.
Sorry, just typed it in. I said, yeah, like Saudi Arabia and the journalist Jamal. I don't know how to pronounce his second name. Sorry.
Yeah, Khashoggi. Yeah, man, that was terrible, man. Like the way that they covered for Saudi after that. I mean, it was absolutely horrific. I'm assuming you guys read some of the transcripts of. It was unreal.
Yeah, and we still supply them with guns and stuff in the same way they do with Israel. So.
Do you think bin Salman is guilty, Anna?
Yeah, definitely. Like when you look at the way he's acted and stuff. And there's been payouts to like the family of the journalist. So
blood money's been paid, yeah.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
Do you think he's guilty, Zuriel?
Bro, you know what I'm gonna say on this? Yeah, it might be controversial, but I'd say usually when you don't have a body, the person is considered missing, isn't it? Until a certain point. So, yeah.
But they said the Turks said, because the Turks are some kind of, in some manner, they're geopolitical, like they're asserting themselves in the region to some extent, the Turks, aren't they? I think we're seeing a rise to an extent of Turkish nationalism, and I think they are flexing a little bit in terms of against Saudi by saying that we have the transcripts, we know you did it, and we're going to sit on this, and then they released some of that information through various channels, didn't they? And
yeah, talking about the operation. Yeah. I think there was a really good PBS or Frontline documentary on MBS, and it covered this topic. It seems like an open and shut case. It's just the question. The question is to what end? What was Khashoggi? Why I would be interested in Amal, seeing as you brought up the point. Why do you think MBS got rid of Jamal, the journalist?
I mean, he was speaking up against the state, wasn't he? I'm not really sure why. Like, it was quite a while ago, so I'm not sure what other reasons it had. But he was like speaking up against the state.
Yeah,
he was quite a prominent journalist. He was with the Washington Post, wasn't he? I think that you could just say maybe it was just the fact he was a prominent journalist. He had been accepted in the US. He wrote for the Washington Post, and he was a critic of the regime. The Saudis saw an opportunity when he was in Istanbul, and the messages, if you read the transcripts, they were saying like if we do it quickly, we put his body parts in acid. And there was this guy that MBS sent who was like a chief assistant to the surgeon, who the person who captured him had someone with him who was like a surgeon, and he had brought that bone saw, right, famously. And he said, I like to listen to classical music while I do it to cadavers. He said, normally I do it to dead bodies, but if I listen to some nice classical music, it should be fine. Like these people.
Another take is that interestingly, Saeed Kamali Dehgan is an Iranian journalist. He worked for The Guardian. He came out and said that Jamal Khashoggi was an informant for him, and that Khashoggi had informed him the Saudis had operated certain media outlets from London, one anti-Iranian media, basically, like one of them was Iran International TV, and was funding these outlets to the tune of $200 million per year. Now, interestingly, when you look at the time when the media outlet was set up, it was just before the 2017 presidential elections in Iran. So, and also the Iran International TV has a penchant for praising MEK, the famous People's Mujahideen, and I can't remember what the rest of the acronym, but the MEK are like the weirdest guerrilla group you will ever come across. They're like Marxist, Islamist, a very weird mix.
They're a bit of a cult.
Yeah, basically a cult. Yeah. the long and short of it, they are a cult. But this channel was supporting them and kind of promoting them. So as I say, Saeed Kamal Dehgan, it's another angle. He basically says, yeah, the same guy who was the right-hand man of MBS, Qahtani, was the same guy who was kind of funding, and the same guy who did the whole purge of the rich people, shakedown of all the rich elite in Saudi Arabia when MBS famously in 2017 put them all in the Ritz-Carlton and shook them down for money. It was the same guy, Qahtani, who was working on behalf of MBS, who set up these channels, who facilitated all of this. So it's interesting because the journalist is well known. He's also worked for CNN, France 24, Channel 4, and all of that. But and I think they even made an official complaint. So it could be that Khashoggi was leaking information that he shouldn't have been leaking.
Oz, can I ask? I reckon that we should have a future topic on Saudi and maybe like include Yemen in it or something. But I think it's a really interesting topic. But Zoe, I just wondered if, because you're talking about the kind of ethno foundations of Israel, right? And I wonder if you have read much into this. I mean, I'm not like a super expert or anything, but I've definitely read into it. And there's this idea, right, that at towards the end of the kind of Second World War, as around the time, obviously, a lot of these countries were founded, namely Israel and so on, that the Saudis met with really prominent members of kind of Roosevelt's administration, maybe even Roosevelt himself, actually, in the closing days of World War II, where they said that they would be aligned to the US after World War II and against kind of obviously the Soviet Union by implication, where they would provide the US with their economic resources, with oil, and so on and so on. In exchange, however, the US and its Western axis, if you like, would allow the Saudis to exert their kind of religious supremacism, if you could define it as a kind of Wahhabi religious or a Sunni extremist religious supremacy, which they exported to all these Muslim countries around the world, right? That you could look at that angle, and then of course at the very foundation of Saudi Arabia, in terms of that the Wahhabis are entrenched or completely embedded in the Saudi state, right? Like, could you not make a similar-ish kind of argument that there is a kind of religious supremacism or exceptionalism inherent to the kind of the founding of the Saudi state?
Exceptionalism. There's a marriage between religion and politics. The religious establishment in Saudi Arabia don't play a role in politics. They leave that for the monarchy. But in terms of a supremacy or an exclusivism, yeah, they don't allow. There's no kind of alternative religious expression which is allowed on a state level. There's a official sanctioned.
But do you think they are allowed to exert that kind of Sunni, maybe quite extreme?
But no, the point I was trying to make was the point I was making is that Saudis, they themselves are Zionists and have been Zionists from the get-go. That's the point. Whether MBS is just the latest iteration of the Zionist trend within the House of Saud, and it goes back to Prince Faisal. It goes back to World War One. It goes back before World War II.
It goes back to the Brits.
Where the Saudis have been Zionists from the get-go, from the inception. That's why they're there. This is the irony. These two countries are not in conflict. What we're seeing now, and you're seeing it in popular media. I don't know, Oz, if you've seen the recent Ramadan shows, like on I think it's like NBC, and other Saudi-owned channels. Like, you know how they have a drama series in Ramadan. And that,
yeah, I've seen them. Yeah.
You know Tash Matash?
Yeah.
Yeah. That guy, the guy who's from that, he's in the thing I'm thinking about now, but I don't know the name of the show. But they're entertaining, doing trade with Israel now. They're literally floating the ideas in these shows. So they've got to the stage now where it's in a popular imagining. And he's talking about how the Palestinians don't rate us, they've never respected us, and why are we helping the Palestinians? We've helped them all this time, and look what have we received for it. So there's a social engineering campaign occurring. Do you know what I mean? To kind of to bring wider society to the same page that the elite in Saudi Arabia are already on and have been for a very long time, and that's the Zionist page.
But I'm saying that alignment with British imperialism initially, and then with the US, which was kind of its inheritor in many ways, was as much a kind of part of the structure of the Saudi state at its founding as it was with Israel, in the sense that the Saudis realized where their power lied. How they were born was through a deal, essentially, with the correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, but the Saudis were one of those kind of rebel forces against the Ottomans, right? And they were told by the British Empire and its allies that if they did so and so and so and so, that they would be supported by the British in terms of forming their own state in the same way that the Jewish nationalists in Palestine were. And the British Empire, in terms of the way it conceded power to these people as it collapsed and it propped up all these regimes with injustice at their core. I mean, the British Empire has a lot to answer for. And I mean, look at, again, you could look at Kashmir in terms of how the India and Pakistan, they say the largest mass migration in history of exodus of people was in the partition, right? And in all the issues that created could all stem to, could be traced back to the British Empire and the awful decisions it made as it collapsed, right? I don't know.
The British, as they're known to do, played both sides. So the India office was supporting the House of Saud, and the Cairo office was supporting the Hashemite dynasty that was based in around Mecca and Medina. So they were playing both sides, and of course, yeah, the Arab revolt, so to speak, was instigated by the British. And that's my argument, is the Arab Spring is very much along the same lines, in that the British utilized local forces which were open to that support, right? So obviously in the case of Tunisia, to bring the conversation full circle, in the case of Tunisia, Rashid Ghannouchi, who was living in Londonistan, was the perfect guy, you get me, he was the British guy to go back over in Tunisia and with the veneer of Islamic democracy come into power. And the British are happy that, you know, their guy is over there, like happy days. What I'm arguing is that the British back in that period played both sides, and they played both sides to the extent of weakening the Arabs. That's the point. It's not as though because they promised them one independent kingdom. They promised the Hashemites one independent kingdom, independent rule away from the Ottomans. That was the point. The point of the Arab revolt is that you fight now, throw over the Ottoman overlordship, and then you can control it. And then, of course, Sykes-Picot and all of that. So what I'm saying is, with the history in full view, the powers that are in position today are of the same ilk. That's the point. The idea that Saudi Arabia and Israel are in some type of conflict today is obviously laughable, right? No one would say that they're in conflict. But up until very recently, that was the official narrative. You know, Saudi doesn't recognize Israel, and they were basically just keeping up appearances when in reality they've been Zionists from the inception. So what I'm saying is that they're in service of the Zionist project. It's not the other way around. Israel is not in the Zionist project, is not in service of Saudi Arabia.
No, I think no. Actually, the Zion people could say that a lot of what Israel does in terms of its rhetoric against Iran is designed to it's trying to play it one side in that kind of dynamic between Saudi and Iran, and that is an element to it. I think there's a bit of quid pro quo there between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, who is the biggest? Who does the Saudis? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. You could talk about it from that angle, but also who's other than the Saudis who has been the most vicious against the Iranian, or angled for war the most against the Iranians? I mean, the Israelis, right? Like they're brothers in that sense. And all I'm trying to say is that the British Empire, there's a theory that they did all of this intentionally from the perspective that they were also trying to put the Jews and the Arabs in a kind of state of perpetual war with each other. They were trying to promise the same bit of land to multiple people, multiple causes, so that the Jews and Arabs would be fighting against each other and not against their common enemy. Like that's
Sean, you wouldn't accept a Jewish conspiracy, so why do you accept a British conspiracy?
I don't think it's a conspiracy, though. I think it's in the national interest. I mean, the fact is, at the time, the British Empire was the dominant force on Earth. Israel isn't, right? Like, I think that you could say that Israel has a power over the greatest powers on Earth, but from a purely practical point of view, just as America, there's a Pax Americana now, the British Empire was the largest empire the world has ever seen. It actually didn't it didn't have to be a conspiracy in the sense of they wanted to restructure the world in their own image. They didn't have to participate in some grand conspiracy. The British could do whatever they want because they were the most powerful empire on Earth. So it's not a conspiracy. If they could see that their empire was collapsing, but they would restructure the world as this empire died in a way that suited them most after the empire died, right? Like you would retreat strategically as an empire, wouldn't you? And I think they played the world. But
yeah, no, but what I'm saying is I don't know why you're entertaining a British conspiracy when you wouldn't entertain a Jewish conspiracy.
Not a conspiracy.
The situation in Palestine was, I don't think it was contingent upon any type of what actually occurred is there was broad, this is what I'm saying, the British had the Saudis on board with their project for Israel. The Saudis okayed it in the sense of they gave the acquiescence. They said, we don't have a problem, we don't have a claim. They even gave up their claim to Palestine after they had taken over from the Hashemites. They said they were even willing to sell it for 20 odd million. Chaim Weizmann, all of this research has come out recently in terms of the archive. It's even in the National Archive where the prince at the time is pictured with one of the founders of the Zionists and the British. So the point is that these conversations were happening between the Israelis, the British and the Saudis from very early on. And so the people who were sold out, the people who were sold out. No, I'm saying the people, no, it was very much open. It wasn't a secret. The people who were sold out were the people of Palestine. It was the people, my point is that for the longest time, Saudi Arabia has been presented as though it's somehow anti-Zionist, or it's within the broader political spectrum or the broader political trend within the Arab world, which is obviously anti-Israel, anti-Zionism. But in reality, what we know now, what we know today is that much like Jordan, much like Egypt post Anwar Sadat, or from Anwar Sadat onwards, these countries were systematically picked off one by one to join the Zionist project. And the reality is
which country? Hold on, which countries?
The human rights club, which is beaten over the heads of selective countries, was only ever used for those countries which did not basically agree or kind of step up, kind of join the party, so to speak, the Zionist party.
But this is why I'm not portraying it as some kind of conspiracy, because it isn't. I don't think that the unifying interest or the common denominator of British foreign policy, I think when there is an empire that has the ability to exert itself. You know, remember how I said before that any country will try and exert itself abroad, right? But when you have an empire that has the ability to exert itself, really globally, then that is what it will do. And I think the British, they saw Zionism as a way of projecting their interests abroad in the early days. That's why they supported it. It's not like I don't think it would be conspiratorial to say that the Israelis strong-armed the British into supporting something that wasn't in their own interest. I think they supported puppet states like Israel, like Saudi Arabia in the early days. But I mean, look at the cozy relationship between the Saudi royal family and the British.
No,
right?
The strong arming comes in when you look at the history of early Israel, and when you look at the terrorist acts committed by Erdogan and other militia from the Israeli side upon the British administration, and you look at the response or lack thereof. We're talking about there were UN special rapporteurs who were kidnapped. There was all types of madness going on, but none of it delegitimized the Zionist project, which is a point that one needs to pause at and consider. Why is it? Hold on a sec. Why is it that the political violence, which was channeled at both the Arabs and the British administration, was never a cause for British soldiers were hanged? Do you know what I mean? It's madness. But I'm saying, why was the response different there? This is where the strong-arming contention would come in. Why was the response by the British different there than, say, the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, and where we know that man like Ian Hart, who then went on to Bahrain and is known as the Butcher of Bahrain, was one of the most famous torturers of the Mau Mau rebellion. What I'm saying is, taking these two examples, right? British administration in Kenya, British administration in Palestine. Why is it that the British administration in Palestine turned a blind eye to widespread terrorist actions by the Erdogan and other groups, whereas in Kenya they were rounded up, the Mau Maus were rounded up into concentration camps and were systematically abused and sometimes killed?
No, there wasn't. I would dispute that to the extent that I don't think the British turned a blind eye completely. I think that when there were these atrocities, I think the British soldiers or the administration did pursue some of these individuals to an extent. And if you look at people, for example, in India, like with the things that the Indians did in their pursuit of independence to the British, which the British later forgave. And I think the difference is maybe in the case of India and in the case of Israel, Israel was already quite a developed state. A lot of the people that migrated to Israel were from developed more developed kind of European countries. They brought their education and their resources with them. The US, the UK saw a potential valuable ally in them, as they did in India when they welcomed these countries into the Commonwealth. I mean, they pretend now that they're all pally-pally, and now we see after Brexit, like this idea of Empire 2.0 and all this malarkey. But they, but the things that the Indians and all these other people did to the British when fighting for independence, and then later on the British, well, okay, fine, here's your independence and let's be friends now. Like, it's not that different, I don't think. Like, in terms of they saw Israel as a valuable ally, and they probably didn't see the Mau Mau in the same way. I don't know.
Wait, so what? I didn't quite catch that. So what's the response to my point about the comparison between the British administration in Palestine and the response to terrorist actions there, and the British administration in Kenya and the response to
your point was that they were more willing to forgive one than the other, right?
No, the point is, you can see an argument for the strong arming when there's literal strong arm tactics being employed, and that doesn't negate or delegitimize the Zionist project.
Okay, so I addressed that point that they that why they might be more willing to forgive one than the other, but you're making the other point as well, that Israel was strong arming them, that they weren't just saying, oh, look, it would be in your interest to support us. I think that you could say that was the case with a lot of these countries. Like if you look at India as well, let's say, you could make the argument that with India, that there were people in India who applied these strong arming tactics, but they also made the case to the British, particularly towards the kind of later days of the Indian independence movement, that it would be in your interests to support our independence. Like there are a lot of people in India who were lobbying the British peacefully for their independence, right? Like there were people in Israel who were lobbying the British as saying, you should support our nationalist movement, our Jewish nationalist movement, because it would be in your interest. But then there were other people in Israel who pursued a more violent approach in terms of fighting for their independence, right? That was, does that answer your question?